It is the summer of 1376, and a woman who should have no power whatsoever is about to change the course of the Catholic Church forever. She has no title. She holds no office. She is the 23rd child of a wool dyer from the city of Siena, and she is 29 years old. She has walked into the heart of Avignon, into the gilded palace where the papacy has sat, anchored in France, for nearly 70 years. And she is preparing to tell the most powerful man in Christendom that he is behaving like a frightened child. Her name is Catherine Benincasa. History will know her as Saint Catherine of Siena, Doctor of the Church, and what she says to Pope Gregory XI in 1376 will not simply move a man, it will move the Church itself. If you have found this channel, you already sense that the great turning points of Catholic history are rarely announced in headlines. They arrive quietly, in letters written by candlelight, in words spoken behind closed doors, in the courage of souls who understood something the institution itself had momentarily forgotten. Stay with us tonight, and if this kind of hidden history speaks to you, a subscription costs nothing, and it means you will not miss what comes next. To understand what Catherine walked into, you have to understand what the Avignon papacy had become by 1376. The popes had lived in Avignon in southern France since 1309. What began as a political accommodation had calcified into something more troubling. A papacy shaped, many believed, by French royal influence, by the preferences of French cardinals, by proximity to wealth and comfort rather than to Rome, to Peter's tomb, to the spiritual heartbeat of the Latin Church. For nearly 7 decades, the Bishop of Rome had not been in Rome. The Papal States were in rebellion. The Church's moral authority was hemorrhaging. And Pope Gregory XI, a French cardinal elevated to the throne of Peter, sat in his palace surrounded by advisors who counseled caution, delay, and the considerable pleasures of Avignon. Gregory XI was not a wicked man. By most accounts, he was earnest, prayerful, and genuinely concerned.
For 400 years, they kept this sealed. We gathered every prophecy they tried to bury into one book, written plainly, nothing hidden, nothing softened. If you want the whole truth, not the version they approved, it's pinned in the top comment. Get it tonight.
For the Church. But he was also constitutionally hesitant, prone to anxiety, easily swayed by the cardinals around him, and caught between the weight of what he knew he should do and the paralysis of actually doing it. He had made a private vow before God, it was said, and Catherine would claim she knew of this vow, that if he became pope, he would return the papacy to Rome. The years had passed. The vow sat unacted upon. Into this atmosphere walks Catherine of Siena. She had not come to Avignon on a whim. She had been writing to Gregory for months before her arrival, letters of a kind that medieval correspondence almost never produced. The letters were not diplomatic. They were not flattering. They were the letters of a soul on fire, addressed to a pope who was, in Catherine's unflinching view, failing at the most essential task before him. But her sweetness carried an edge that would have made most men flinch. She wrote to him of courage, specifically of the kind of courage he was not showing. She told him directly that she had heard of a private vow he had made to God about returning to Rome, and she called him, through that knowledge, to accountability. She demanded he appoint virtuous men as shepherds of the Church, rather than the ambitious wolves she saw devouring the flock. She called for reform of the clergy with a bluntness that bordered on rebuke. And then there is the phrase that has echoed through Catholic memory for 6.5 centuries. In her letters to Gregory and the letters of Saint Catherine of Siena are documented, preserved, among the most remarkable epistolary collections in Church history. She told him, in substance, to stop being a timid child. She told him, "Up, Father, like a man." And she pressed him toward the bitterness that was, as she wrote, the only path to sweetness. Take courage, Father." These are not softened paraphrases for polite modern ears. This is the actual texture of Catherine's correspondence, direct, urgent, spiritually relentless. She was not insulting Gregory. She was calling him upward, toward the greatness she believed God had placed in his office. She understood something that his cautious cardinals did not, that hesitation in the face of a sacred duty is its own kind of wound, and that a pope who would not act was not keeping the peace. He was losing it by degrees. She arrived in Avignon in June of 1376. She spent 3 months there.
If your heart is heavy, that feeling is a grace, but don't stop at fear. We wrote the prayers to answer it. The rosary, the consecration, the protection for you and the ones you love. Don't face what's coming unprepared. It's pinned in the top comment. Get it tonight.
She met with Gregory personally multiple times, and she pressed upon him again and again the same message she had been sending in ink, that Rome waited, that the Church bled, that the vow he had made before God was not a small thing he could indefinitely defer. The cardinals around Gregory were furious. Several of them tried to test her, to expose her as a fraud or a pawn of Florentine political interests. Catherine held her ground with the composure of someone who understood that she was not there on her own authority. She was there on the authority of the crucified Christ she spoke about in every letter. That, she believed, was the only authority that mattered. What happened in January of 1377 is one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the medieval church. Pope Gregory XI left Avignon. He returned to Rome. The 70-year Avignon period, what some of his contemporaries had called the Babylonian captivity of the church, was over. Catherine of Siena, the wool dyer's daughter, with no office and no title, had done what cardinals and kings and political pressure had failed to do for 7 decades. She had reminded a pope of who he was, and he had listened. She died in Rome in April of 1380, 3 years after the return she had urged and wept and prayed for. She was 33 years old, the age of Christ at the crucifixion, a detail the faithful of her time did not miss. She was canonized in 1461. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her a Doctor of the Church, one of only 4 women ever to receive that title, and called her writings a luminous testimony of holiness and wisdom. Her feast is celebrated on the 29th of April. Her letters remain. They do not age. They do not soften with the centuries. They read even now as the words of someone who is watching the church from a vantage point slightly outside ordinary time, someone who sees clearly what those inside the institution have allowed fear and comfort to obscure. And this is where the faithful who watch carefully begin to notice something. On the evening of May 8, 2025, white smoke rose over the Sistine Chapel. The loggia of St. Peter's Basilica opened, and a new pope appeared before the world. Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, an Augustinian born in Chicago, had been elected the 267th successor of St. Peter. He took the name Leo XIV. He paused, and then he continued. He said that these were the first words spoken by the risen Christ, the Good Shepherd who laid down his life for God's flock. He said he wished this greeting of peace to resound in the hearts of families, among all people, wherever they might be, in every nation. Now, the careful observer does not claim that Catherine of Siena predicted Leo XIV. That is not what this channel does, and it is not what honesty allows. What Catherine wrote pertained to her time, to Gregory XI, to the Avignon crisis of the 14th century. Her letters do not contain a secret code pointing to a 21st century pope. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. But the faithful have always understood that the problems of the church are not entirely new problems, that the virtues required to meet those problems are not entirely new virtues, and that the voice of the saints does not simply belong to the past. Saints become doctors of the church precisely because their wisdom transcends their moment. Catherine's diagnosis of what makes the church stumble, fear at the top, silence in the face of needed reform, the preference for comfort over prophetic courage, is not a medieval problem that was solved in 1377 and filed away. The themes that Catherine pressed upon Gregory XI are the themes that Catholics in 2025 are still living with. The question of whether the church speaks with genuine courage or manages its image. The question of whether its leaders appoint virtuous men or convenient ones. The question of whether the papacy acts from its true center, spiritually, theologically, symbolically, or drifts toward the accommodations that the world finds easier to accept. And when Leo XIV stepped to the loggia and offered peace, not the peace of political compromise, not a managed and diplomatic peace, but peace that he described as unarmed and disarming, humble and persevering, the echo that some Catholics heard was not imaginary. It was the echo of a long tradition about what genuine Christian authority actually sounds like. Not triumphalist, not defensive, not wrapped in the language of institutional management, but rooted, grounded, given from a place of interiority rather than performance. She wanted a pope whose authority came from the inside, not the outside. A pope who could speak courage because he had first surrendered fear. A pope who could call for reform because he had first submitted himself to the same reform in his own soul. Whether Leo XIV is that pope, only time and God know. The Church has learned, through long centuries, not to canonize the living. What the faithful can do is pay attention to the themes, to the continuities, to the places where the voice of the saints and the voice of the present seem to be, however mysteriously, in conversation. There is a tradition in Catholic spirituality, ancient, rooted in the understanding of how God works across history, that the saints do not simply intercede for us and then fall silent. They remain present to the Church in a way that the living cannot fully map. When Catherine of Siena urged Gregory XI to be a manly man, to take hold of the bitterness that strengthens, to return the papacy to its true home, she was not only speaking to one frightened French pope in 1376, she was speaking from a depth of understanding about the Church that belongs to all the centuries she now inhabits. The Avignon crisis was not, at its core, about geography. It was about whether the Church would allow itself to be shaped by fear and worldly comfort, or whether it would find the courage to be what it was called to be, even when that meant leaving the palace, crossing the mountains, and returning to a Rome that was difficult and complicated and alive with conflict. Every generation of Catholics faces its own version of that choice. Every papacy, in some form, is asked whether it will stay in Avignon or return to Rome. What Catherine understood, and what she articulated with a fire that still burns in her letters, is that the answer to that question is never finally settled. It is asked again, always, of the people who hold the office now. And the voice that asks it, across the centuries, belongs to those who loved the Church enough to tell it the truth, even when the truth required walking into a gilded palace, with no title and no power, and saying to the most powerful man in Christendom, "Be not a timorous child, but manly. Return to where you belong. Fulfill the vow you made to God." The wool dyer's daughter from Siena said this at 29. She died at 33, having changed the course of the Church. And she was declared a doctor of the Universal Church nearly 6 centuries later, because the Church recognized, eventually, that she had seen something true. Whether we are living in a moment when that same clarity is being summoned again, when a new Leo is being asked, in ways no living soul fully understands, to meet the hour with the kind of courage Catherine demanded, that is not something any commentator can settle. It is something you will watch unfold, night by night, if you are paying attention. And the faithful who are paying attention are the ones who have always understood that the most important things happen quietly, in letters written by candlelight, in words spoken above a crowded square, in the courage of souls who hear, beneath the noise of any given moment, the long and patient voice of a Church that is older than any of its crises and will outlast every one of them. Catherine of Siena wrote to a pope in 1376. Pope Leo XIV spoke to the world in 2025. Between those two moments lies 6.5 centuries of a Church that has stumbled and risen, that has lost its way and found it again, that is needed, in every generation, someone willing to say the hardest thing with the greatest love. Tonight, on this channel, we name what we see. We do not pretend to know what God is doing, but we watch, and we remember, and we hold in our hands the letters of a saint who is not afraid to speak, and we find that they are still warm.